Picture the most ordinary Thursday afternoon you can imagine. October in Middle America. The leaves are turning that particular shade of rust and gold that makes everything look like a painting someone hung on the wall of a house that is trying very hard to feel like a home. School buses are making their rounds. Neighbors are pulling into driveways. Someone a few streets over is burning leaves in their backyard, and that smell, that particular smell of autumn in a Midwestern suburb, is drifting through every cracked car window in the neighborhood. Nothing about this afternoon announces itself. Nothing says, pay attention. Nothing says, this is the day that tears your entire life in half. For Diane Mercer, 44 years old, a registered dental hygienist from a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, that Thursday began like every other Thursday of the last 12 years of her marriage. She woke up at 6:15. She made coffee. She got her daughter, 11-year-old Madison, fed and dressed, and onto the school bus. She drove to work, spent 8 hours cleaning other people's teeth, listened to other people's problems, and at 4:30 in the afternoon, she climbed back into her white Chevy Equinox and started making her way home. She had a list in her head: pick up Madison, stop at Kroger for chicken thighs and a box of pasta, get home before her husband Raymond got in from work so she could have dinner on the table by 7. Raymond Mercer was a regional sales manager for a mid-sized logistics company. He drove a company truck. He was reliable, moderately charming at family gatherings, coached youth soccer on the weekends when he wasn't traveling for work, and remembered birthdays. He was, by all external measures, exactly the kind of man you would hold up as proof that normal, good marriages still exist. The kind of man other women told Diane she was lucky to have. And Diane, for 12 years, believed them. She had no reason not to. She made the wrong turn at Sycamore and Elm. That is where this story actually begins. Not at the wedding, not at the first lie, not even at the first night Raymond Mercer slept in a house 3 miles from his own. It begins with a wrong turn. A construction detour that hadn't been there the day before had pushed her off her usual route, and she found herself rolling slowly down Whitmore Drive, a street she recognized by name but had never actually driven. She was reaching for her phone to pull up directions when she glanced up and her hands went still on the wheel. There was a gray craftsman-style house with a black front door and a porch with 2 rocking chairs and flower boxes on the windows. And standing in the front yard, holding a little boy, a child no older than 2 or 3, was her husband, Raymond Mercer, in his work clothes, sleeves rolled up, laughing at something the child was doing with a plastic truck in the grass. A woman came out through the front door and put her hand on Raymond's back. She was younger than Diane. She was smiling the way you smile when you are completely at ease. When you are home. Raymond turned and kissed her on the cheek and bounced the little boy on his hip, and in that instant, in the span of one breath, Diane Mercer's entire life ceased to be the thing she thought it was. She did not get out of the car. She did not honk the horn. She did not scream or cry or call anyone. She sat there for 4 minutes. She would later remember looking at the clock on the dashboard, for 47 when she stopped, for 51 when she finally put the car in drive and pulled away, and she watched her husband be someone else's husband. She drove 2 blocks before she had to pull over because she couldn't see the road, and she sat on the side of Whitmore Drive with the engine running and the heat on, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary October afternoon, and understood that everything she had built her life around was a lie. Before we go any further, and I promise you, we are going to go much further, there are 3 questions that sit at the center of everything you are about to hear. 3 questions that feel simple on the surface, but get harder and harder to answer the longer you sit with them. The first question is this: how does a man maintain 2 complete families, 2 wives, 2 sets of children, 2 mortgages, 2 Christmas mornings, 2 Valentine's days, 2 school plays, and 2 bedtime routines, in the same mid-sized American city, for over a decade, without either family ever finding out? The second question is, who else knew? And the third question, the one that will stay with you long after this video ends, is, when Diane finally confronted Raymond, what did he say? And why did part of her wish she had never found out at all? Before we go any deeper into what happened, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one are why this channel exists. Because the truth is, this is not as rare as you want to believe it is. According to family law attorneys across the United States, secret second families are far more common than the public realizes. They happen in suburbs and cities, in wealthy households and working-class ones, in religious communities and secular ones. They happen to women who, by every measure, should have seen it coming, and to women who were so carefully deceived that no amount of vigilance would have made a difference. Raymond Mercer was the second kind. What he built was not a casual affair that drifted into something more. It was a deliberate, methodical, sustained deception that required planning, scheduling, financial management, and a level of emotional compartmentalization that most psychologists will tell you sits at the outer edges of what the human mind is capable of. He was not sloppy. He was not reckless. For over a decade, he made almost no mistakes. What unraveled him, in the end, was not a private investigator, not a jealous friend, not a text message left open on a counter. What unraveled Raymond Mercer was a construction detour on a Thursday afternoon in October. One wrong turn. 3 miles. To understand what Raymond Mercer did, you have to understand who Raymond Mercer was. And who he was, at least on paper, was somebody who had earned the right to feel good about his life. He grew up in Gahanna, Ohio, a middle-class suburb northeast of Columbus, the second of 3 kids. His father, Gary Mercer, worked 31 years at a manufacturing plant and coached Little League. His mother, Carol, was a school secretary who made dinner every night and kept the house so clean it almost felt like a museum of normalcy. Raymond was the one who inherited his father's ease with people, the handshake, the eye contact, the laugh that made you feel like whatever you just said was the most interesting thing he'd heard all week. He was the kid who ran for class treasurer and won, not because he wanted the job, but because everyone just naturally voted for him. He met Diane Patterson in the fall of 1999 at a mutual friend's birthday party in downtown Columbus. She was 23. He was 26. She remembers thinking he seemed too put together to be real, the kind of guy who opened car doors without making it seem like a performance. They dated for 2 years, got engaged in the fall of 2001, and were married on June 8, 2002, at a church in Westerville, Ohio, with 112 guests, a 4-piece band, and a reception that went until midnight. Everyone who was there remembers it as one of those weddings where you actually believed, without any cynicism at all, that 2 people were choosing each other in a way that was going to last. For the first several years, it did last. Raymond was promoted twice at his logistics company. Diane finished her dental hygiene certification and found a position at a practice 7 minutes from their home. In 2004, they bought a 4-bedroom house in a development called Stonebrook Crossing, brick front, attached garage, good school district, exactly the kind of house you point at when someone asks what the American dream looks like. Their daughter Madison was born in 2012, arriving after 2 years of trying and 1 miscarriage that Diane still describes as the hardest thing she has ever been through. Raymond was in the delivery room. He cried when Madison was born. Diane will tell you that with complete certainty. He cried. And that matters, because it means whatever Raymond Mercer became, he also was, genuinely, and at the same time, that man. The work travel started in 2009. Raymond's company was expanding its regional territory, and the new position came with longer hours, more overnight trips, more Friday nights away, and Monday morning returns. Diane accepted it the way most working-class American spouses accept inconvenience, with quiet practicality. The money was better. The health insurance was better. The promotion came with a company vehicle and an expense account. You take the trade-off. You tell yourself it's temporary. You stop asking as many questions because the answers are always the same, and asking feels like you don't trust the person, and you do trust them, so you stop asking. That quiet arithmetic, the math of everyday trust, is what Raymond relied on. And it worked for a very long time. What Diane did not know, what she had no reason even to imagine, was that the work travel, at least some of it, had a second function. By the time Madison was a year old, Raymond Mercer had already been maintaining a separate life for 2 years. Her name was Crystal Hollis. She was 31 years old in 2013, a medical billing specialist who worked from home, originally from Chillicothe, Ohio. She had moved to a neighborhood called Birchwood Commons on the west side of Columbus in 2011, and she and Raymond had met through a work event, a regional industry mixer at a hotel downtown, in the spring of that year. By the fall of 2012, Crystal Hollis was pregnant with Raymond Mercer's child. And Raymond Mercer did not tell her he had a wife. This is the part that stops people when they hear it. Not that a man had an affair. Affairs happen, painfully and regularly, in marriages all over this country and every other. What stops people is the scale of the commitment Raymond made to the second life. He did not set Crystal up in an apartment across town and visit on Tuesdays. He did not maintain a casual, low-stakes parallel relationship that could be ended with a difficult conversation and a check. He moved Crystal into a house. He helped her pick it out. He paid half the mortgage through a separate bank account he had opened 3 years earlier, using a version of his middle name. Raymond David Mercer became David R. Mercer on the account, at a credit union in Hilliard that he had specifically chosen because it had no branches near his home or his office. He thought of everything. He thought of almost everything. Crystal Hollis believed she was in a relationship with a man who worked demanding hours, traveled frequently, and was navigating the early stages of a divorce from a marriage that had been over in every meaningful way for years. Raymond had constructed this story carefully, not in one conversation, but over months of carefully deployed details. There had been a marriage, yes. It had broken down. There were legal complications with assets and custody. His attorney had advised him to maintain the formal structure of the arrangement until the paperwork was finalized, and his wife had agreed to that, because the amicable separation protected both of them financially. It was the kind of story that sounds completely plausible when someone you love tells it to you slowly, piece by piece, over dinners and Sunday mornings and long phone calls when he was traveling. It sounds like the complicated, messy reality of adult life, which is exactly what it was designed to sound like. Their son, a boy Crystal named Jackson, was born in July of 2013. Raymond was present for the birth. He held the baby in the delivery room at Riverside Methodist Hospital. He sat in the plastic chair next to Crystal's hospital bed and talked about the future, where Jackson would go to school, what sports he might play, whether the backyard at Birchwood Commons was big enough for a swing set. And 11 days later, he drove across the city to his home in Stonebrook Crossing and sat at his own kitchen table and had dinner with his wife Diane and their daughter Madison and talked about work and asked how Madison's swim lessons were going, and gave absolutely no outward sign of what he had just done. None. The man had developed an ability to be completely, authentically present in whatever life he was standing in at that moment. He was not haunted, not distracted, not obviously carrying the
Raymond
weight
Mercer's
of
double
life required the management of a second
he had
shift
mastered
job.
the art of hiding
Think about
it
that.
so completely
After
that
the
nobody
ordinary
could see it.
demands of his actual career, the sales calls, the quarterly reports, the team meetings and customer dinners, he came home to a parallel set of demands that were no less real and no less requiring of his time and attention. There were 2 households to financially support, 2 women whose emotional needs he was responsible for meeting, 2 children whose development he was watching, whose milestones he was supposed to be present for, 2 sets of school calendars, 2 sets of pediatric appointments, 2 separate social worlds that could never, under any circumstances, overlap. Financially, Raymond managed the split through a combination of careful planning and the kind of income that, while not wealthy by any measure, provided just enough margin. His base salary as a regional sales manager was $68,000 a year, with performance bonuses that brought the total to somewhere between $75,000 and $85,000 in good years. He had renegotiated Crystal's mortgage twice, always in ways that kept the payment manageable, and he had established a pattern of cash withdrawals from the David R. Mercer account that he used for Crystal's household expenses, groceries, utilities, Jackson's daycare, the small repairs that come with owning a house. Diane had her own income and managed most of the Stonebrook Crossing expenses herself, which meant Raymond's contributions to that household were supplemental rather than primary, freeing up enough cash flow to sustain the fiction. The calendar was the thing Raymond guarded most fiercely. He used 2 phones, a fact that Diane never questioned because the company issued employees a work phone, and the idea of a man carrying 2 phones had long since stopped being unusual in a world where everyone had a work device and a personal one. What Diane did not know was that both phones were personal. The work phone was Crystal's line. Raymond's schedule was structured around a weekly rhythm that he maintained with near-military discipline. Monday through Wednesday, he was physically at the Stonebrook Crossing house with Diane and Madison. Thursday and Friday, he was traveling for work, which placed him at Birchwood Commons with Crystal and Jackson. Weekends alternated on a loose rotation that he adjusted based on school events, family obligations, and whatever other variable might disrupt the pattern. The work trips were his most important structural fiction. He had, over the years, developed a plausible and detailed mythology around his regional territory, client accounts in Cincinnati, distribution centers near Dayton, a regional conference in Cleveland every fall. These trips explained his absences so completely that Diane never felt the need to verify them. She occasionally texted him during trips. He always responded. He was always exactly where he said he was, or close enough that the time stamp and the content of his messages matched. He was careful about background sounds, careful about photos, careful about the details that get picked up in offhand conversation. He was, in short, a professional-grade liar, not in the sense of being cold or calculated in his effect, but in the sense of having committed to the craft of deception so thoroughly that it had become, over time, second nature. Crystal's understanding of Raymond's situation evolved slowly. By 2015, 2 years after Jackson was born, Raymond had told her that the divorce proceedings were stalled due to a contested asset dispute involving a property his parents had left him in a trust. It was a credible delay. Real divorces get held up over exactly these kinds of complications. Crystal was frustrated but patient. She loved him. She had a child with him. She had organized her entire life around the expectation that once the legal situation resolved, they would be a normal family. She had turned down a job offer in Cincinnati in 2016 because it would have taken her too far from Columbus, too far from Raymond. She had told her mother, Shirley Hollis of Chillicothe, that she was in a long-term relationship with a man who was in the process of divorcing and that things were complicated but ultimately going to work out. Shirley Hollis did not entirely trust Raymond, but she trusted her daughter's judgment more than her own suspicion, and so she waited. On the Stonebrook Crossing side of Raymond's life, there were no dramatic red flags, or rather, the flags that existed were the kind that, viewed individually, each has a perfectly reasonable explanation. He was protective of his phone, but he'd always been private with technology. He sometimes seemed distracted during dinner, but he worked demanding hours and was often tired. There were occasional stretches where he seemed less emotionally available, more inside his own head, and Diane would wonder about it briefly, and then the week would move on, and she would forget she had wondered. There was one night in 2016. She will tell you this with the specific texture of someone who has replayed a memory hundreds of times looking for what they missed. When she woke up at 2 in the morning and he wasn't in bed. She found him downstairs in the kitchen, sitting in the dark with his phone on the table. He told her he couldn't sleep and had come down for water. She believed him. She went back to bed. It was the truth, and it wasn't. By 2018, Raymond Mercer's double life had been running for 7 years. Jackson was 5 years old and starting kindergarten. Madison was 6. They were in the same Columbus City School District, different elementary schools, different sides of the district boundary line, but the same administrative structure, the same seasonal events, the same pool of parents who sometimes showed up at the same soccer leagues and community events without ever knowing they were connected through the same man. Raymond was aware of this proximity. It was, in fact, one of the reasons he had chosen Birchwood Commons when Crystal was looking for a house in 2011. He had steered the search carefully, toward neighborhoods that were close enough for him to access easily, but socially separated enough from Stonebrook Crossing that the two worlds would not naturally collide. What he could not fully control was the random, frictionless collision of social media. In 2018, a woman named Patricia Yates, who attended the same church as Crystal Hollis and had become a casual friend through a neighborhood Facebook group, happened to have a cousin whose husband worked in the same industry as Raymond. At a family barbecue in July of that year, Patricia's cousin mentioned a sales manager at a Columbus logistics company who had won some regional award, and Patricia said, "Funny, my friend Crystal is dating someone in logistics." Nothing came of it. Patricia did not pursue it. The cousin did not think of it again. But the conversation happened. It existed, however briefly, as a thread that connected the two worlds. Raymond never knew. He never knew how close the walls of his life had come to collapsing 2 full years before they did. The financial strain was the most quietly persistent source of risk. By 2019, Raymond was managing 2 full household budgets on a single income that had been good but not extraordinary. The performance bonuses had been inconsistent over the last 2 years as the company's regional numbers softened. Crystal's rent had increased. Madison was entering middle school, and the costs associated with that, activities, clothes, the social expectations of an American tween, were creeping upward. Raymond had begun to move money between his two accounts in ways that were less careful than they had been in the early years, making slightly larger transfers, using the David R. Mercer account for occasional purchases that could, theoretically, have been traced back to him if anyone were looking at the right records. He was tired. 7 years of this kind of sustained, meticulous management produces a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up on a physical exam. It is the exhaustion of a mind that never, not for a single day, gets to stop performing. Crystal, by 2019, was done waiting for the divorce to finalize. Jackson was 6 years old and asking why his dad didn't live with them all the time like his friends' dads. Crystal had been patient for 8 years. She had restructured her entire life around a promise that had been renewed so many times it had started to feel like it was never going to be kept. In the spring of 2019, she told Raymond that she needed a timeline, not a vague reassurance, not another story about asset disputes and attorney delays. A date, something concrete that she could hold on to. Raymond told her 6 months. She marked it on a calendar in her kitchen, November 2019, and told her mother, and let herself feel hopeful in a way she had not allowed herself to feel for years. 6 months came and went, and then Raymond had a new story, a new delay, a new complication involving a refinancing issue at the bank. And Crystal Hollis, for the first time, began to let herself wonder if any of it was true. She did not hire a private investigator. She did not go through his phone. What she did, in January of 2020, on a Wednesday evening when Raymond was supposed to be in a meeting and wasn't answering her texts, was type his name into a Google search she had never run before. Not Raymond Mercer alone, which returned nothing particularly useful. She added Columbus, Ohio, and logistics, and a year, and what came back was a brief mention in a local business news item from 2017. The same regional award that Patricia's cousin had mentioned at that barbecue, which Crystal had never connected to Raymond because she had never heard the story. The article listed his employer, his title, and his city of residence. His city of residence was listed as the neighborhood of Stonebrook Crossing, the neighborhood where Crystal did not live. She sat with that for 3 days. She told herself there were explanations. Maybe it was an old address. Maybe it was a data error. Maybe the article had been wrong. She ran a second search, this time for property records, and found it within 20 minutes. A county property record listing Raymond D. Mercer as a co-owner of a home at a specific address in Stonebrook Crossing, purchased in 2004. The co-owner's name was listed as Diane L. Mercer. Crystal Hollis had no way of knowing that Diane L. Mercer was Raymond's wife. The name meant nothing to her. Raymond had never mentioned a name, but the property record said co-owner. It said 2004. It said the mortgage was active, and none of it lined up with anything Raymond had ever told her. We come back now to Thursday, October 10th, 2019. That is the date of the wrong turn. That is the date Diane Mercer drove down Whitmore Drive and saw her husband holding a child she had never seen. That is the date everything broke open on the east side of Raymond's life. And here is where the story takes the kind of turn that sounds impossible until you realize it happened, because that same week, on the west side, Crystal Hollis was doing something she had never done before. She was driving past a house in Stonebrook Crossing. She had the address from the county property record she had found in January. She had held on to it for 9 months, telling herself she was being paranoid, telling herself she trusted Raymond, telling herself the explanation would come. And then one day she could not hold on to it anymore, and she drove there. They did not see each other. Diane did not see Crystal. Crystal did not see Diane. But on the same week, within 4 days of each other, both women drove to the other's neighborhood and sat in their cars and looked at a house and understood that something was profoundly wrong. Diane had seen Raymond. Crystal had seen only a house, a brick front 4-bedroom with an attached garage and a child's bicycle tipped over in the driveway. But seeing the house was enough, because it was clearly lived in. It was clearly a home, and it was registered to a man she knew and a woman she did not, under a mortgage that had been active since 2004, 3 full years before Crystal had met Raymond and 8 years before he had told her the marriage was basically over. Diane went home that first Thursday and said nothing. She needed to understand what she had seen before she could confront it. She spent 3 days in a state that she later described as something like being underwater. She could see everything, could function in the world, could get Madison off to school and go to work and make dinner, but it was all happening behind glass, at a remove, as though she were watching herself from somewhere slightly outside her own body. She did not cry that week. She would cry later, at volume and length that surprised her, but that first week she did not cry. She moved through the hours with a strange, terrible calm, and at night, after Raymond was asleep, she lay in the dark next to him and felt the distance between them as something physical, as though there were a body length of cold water in the bed where she thought a husband had been. She pulled their bank records. That was the first practical step, taken on the Saturday after the wrong turn. She sat at the kitchen table while Raymond was at a soccer practice with Madison, and she went back 18 months through their joint account, and then, because she still had the password from when she had done their taxes 2 years earlier, into Raymond's individual account. What she found there was not the hidden second account. She didn't know to look for the David R. Mercer account at a Hilliard credit union. What she found was a pattern of ATM withdrawals, always in cash, always from machines on the west side of Columbus, in amounts that ranged from $200 to $400, occurring on a regular and predictable schedule that bore no relationship to any business trip or stated expense she could identify. Over 18 months, those withdrawals totaled just over $11,000. Cash, untraceable once it left the machine, going somewhere that was not this house. She did not confront him that weekend. She was not ready. She needed more. She needed to understand the scope of what she was dealing with before she put the question into the air between them, because she understood, with the practical intelligence of a woman who has been quietly competent her entire adult life, that once she asked, the conversation would take on its own momentum and she would no longer be in control of how it went. So she waited. She called her sister, Karen, who lived in Dublin, Ohio, and told her only that she was having a difficult week and needed coffee. Karen came over on a Sunday afternoon, and they sat on the back porch while Madison watched television inside, and Diane said, slowly, that she thought something might be wrong with her marriage. Not the whole story, just the first small piece of it, held out for someone else to see. Meanwhile, Crystal Hollis had done something Diane had not. She had asked Raymond directly. Not about a second family. She didn't have that language yet. She asked him about the house in Stonebrook Crossing. She mentioned the name on the county record. She watched his face when she said Diane L. Mercer, and what she saw in his face in that moment told her everything she needed to know before he said a single word. She described it later as a flicker, a fraction of a second in which the mask came completely off and she saw underneath it. And what was underneath it was not remorse or guilt, but something closer to calculation. He was deciding, in that fraction of a second, what version of the truth to tell her. And when he spoke, it was with the same measured, reasonable tone he had used for 8 years. He told her Diane was his ex-wife. He told her the property was still in both names due to an unresolved legal matter. He told Crystal he should have explained this earlier, and he was sorry for the confusion. Crystal did not believe him. For the first time in 8 years, she did not believe a single word. Diane chose a Tuesday evening in late October. Madison was spending the night at her friend Emma's house. Diane had made dinner. Not a special dinner, not a pointed gesture, just pasta and salad, the regular Tuesday dinner. And they had eaten it, and Raymond had talked about his week, and she had listened and nodded and passed the bread. And then she put her fork down and looked at him across the table and said, I drove down Whitmore Drive a few weeks ago. I saw you. She did not say more than that. She just watched his face. And what she saw was not what Crystal had seen. There was no flicker of calculation. What Diane saw was something that looked, devastatingly, like relief. Raymond Mercer did not lie. Not that night. Whatever force had sustained the deception for 12 years seemed to leave him completely the moment Diane said those words. He sat back in his chair, and he put his hands flat on the table, and he told her, not everything. Not the full account-by-account financial architecture, not the precise chronology, not the specific lies in their specific order, but the essential facts. Crystal, Jackson, the house on Whitmore Drive, how long it had been going on, that Crystal believed they were in a committed relationship, and that the marriage to Diane was effectively over. that he had told Crystal he was separated and in the process of finalizing a divorce that did not exist. He said these things in a voice that was completely steady, and Diane sat across from him at the table where they had eaten 1,000 dinners and listened and felt the room tilt slowly on its axis. She asked him 3 questions. She would remember them exactly, in sequence, for the rest of her life. The first was, does she know about me? The second was, does she know about Madison? And the third was, were you ever going to tell either of us? Raymond answered the first 2 questions with the same word, no. Crystal did not know Diane existed. Crystal did not know Madison existed. An 11-year-old girl had a half-brother 3 miles away, and neither child knew the other was alive. Raymond's answer to the third question was not a word. It was a long silence, and then he said he didn't know. And Diane Mercer, who had not cried since the Thursday of the wrong turn, began to cry then. Not because of the betrayal, though the betrayal was enormous and real and would take years to fully process. She cried because of the third answer. Because, I don't know, meant there had never been a plan to stop. There had never been an exit. He had not been managing a temporary deception while he figured out how to come clean. He had been managing a permanent architecture with no intended conclusion. This had been, in his mind, the way things were going to be. Crystal's confrontation came 4 days later, and it was different in every way. By then, Raymond had called her. He had called her from his car on the night of the Tuesday confrontation with Diane, before he had even fully processed the conversation, and he had told Crystal that Diane had found out. He told Crystal the same way he had told Diane, steadily, factually, without apparent emotion. He told Crystal that he needed time. He told her he was sorry. Crystal asked him the same first question Diane had asked. Does she know about me? Raymond said yes. Crystal asked, did you ever intend to leave her? And Raymond said, again, in that same measured voice, that he had always intended to figure it out. Crystal told him that was not an answer. Raymond said he knew. They did not speak again that night. Crystal drove to her mother's house in Chillicothe with Jackson buckled in the back seat and did not come back to Columbus for 4 days. What happened next is the part of this story that most people don't expect. Most of us, hearing this story, imagine that the 2 women would be adversaries, that Diane's anger would be directed at Crystal, that Crystal would feel some possessiveness toward Raymond that would put her and Diane in opposition. But that is not what happened. What happened is that Crystal Hollis called Diane Mercer. She found the number through a search of the property records she already had, cross-referenced with a White Pages listing, and she called the Stonebrook Crossing house on a Thursday morning in November 2019, and Diane picked up, and Crystal said, I think we need to talk. And Diane said, I know who you are. And both women were quiet for a moment, and then they agreed to meet. They met at a Panera on Polaris Parkway on a Friday morning when both their children were in school. Diane came with her sister Karen. Crystal came alone. They had never seen each other in person before, only, from a distance, through the windows of their respective cars on separate days in separate neighborhoods. They sat across from each other and ordered coffee, and neither of them spoke for almost a full minute. And then Crystal said, he told me you were separated. He told me the marriage was basically over. And Diane said, we just renewed our vows 3 years ago, for our 10th anniversary. The silence after that sentence lasted a long time. There is no drama that could adequately represent what passed between those 2 women at a table in a Panera on a Friday morning in Columbus, Ohio. There are moments in human experience that language is not built to hold. What emerged from that conversation, over 2.5 hours, over refills of coffee that neither of them particularly wanted, was a composite picture of Raymond Mercer that was, in some ways, more disturbing than either woman had been able to construct on her own. Because taken separately, each woman's experience of Raymond was coherent. He was attentive, reliable, sometimes distracted, occasionally absent in ways that had rational explanations. He remembered important dates. He was good with their children. He showed up when it mattered. The version of Raymond that Diane knew and the version that Crystal knew were both real. That was the part that defied simple explanation. He had not been performing love for one of them while genuinely feeling it for the other. He had been, to all available evidence, genuinely present in both lives, genuinely invested in both relationships, genuinely connected to both children. Diane would later tell her therapist, she started seeing a therapist 6 weeks after the confrontation, that the hardest thing to reconcile was not the lying itself, but the evidence that Raymond had been capable of full and real emotional engagement in two places simultaneously. If it had been cold, she said, if he had been using both of us, just playing a role in both houses, I think I could have made sense of it. But he wasn't cold. He was warm. He was the same warm person in both places. Which means that person I thought I knew wasn't a fiction. He was real. He just also had an entire other real life that I knew nothing about. And I don't know which is worse, being deceived by a fake person or finding out the real person you loved is also capable of this. That question does not have a clean answer. It is one of the questions that stays. Crystal's reckoning had a different texture. She had given 8 years of her life to a relationship she believed was heading toward something. She had made geographic, professional, and social decisions based on the expectation of a future that Raymond had described in detail and never intended to deliver. She had told her son that his father was working on something important every week when Jackson asked why Daddy didn't sleep there. She had defended Raymond to her mother, to her friends, to her own better instincts on dozens of occasions when something fell off. And the thing that hit her hardest, she said, was not that Raymond had a wife. It was that he had a daughter. A little girl named Madison who was almost exactly Jackson's age. Jackson had a sister he didn't know about. That detail, the children, was the one that neither woman could process without breaking down completely. The legal situation that followed was, in the language of the attorneys involved, complex. In the state of Ohio, bigamy is a criminal offense, a first-degree misdemeanor for a first offense, carrying a maximum sentence of 6 months in county jail and a fine of up to $1,000. Raymond had not legally married Crystal. He had never gone through a ceremony, never signed a marriage license, never legally represented himself as her husband to the state. What he had done was maintain a long-term committed relationship under false pretenses, provide financial support for a household and a child under a false identity, and sustain a fraud that impacted 2 women and 2 children over the better part of a decade. But Ohio's criminal statutes are not well equipped to address that specific set of facts. Without a second marriage license, there is no bigamy charge. Without a marriage, there is no fraud charge tied to the institution of marriage. The law, in this case, offered considerably less than either woman wanted from it. Diane filed for divorce in November 2019, 6 weeks after the confrontation. Her attorney, a Columbus family law specialist named Gerald Whitfield, moved immediately to secure full financial disclosure, including a court order requiring Raymond to produce all bank account records in any name for the previous 5 years. That order is how the David R. Mercer account at the Hilliard Credit Union came to light. The account, which had held as much as $31,000 at one point and had processed roughly $260,000 in transactions over its 10-year existence, became the centerpiece of the divorce proceedings. Diane's legal team argued, successfully, that the funds Raymond had directed toward Crystal's household represented a dissipation of marital assets. The court agreed. Raymond's financial settlement in the divorce was significantly worse than it would have been under ordinary circumstances, reflecting the court's finding that he had redirected marital funds to support a separate household over a sustained period. Crystal's legal situation was different and, in some ways, more difficult. She had no formal legal claim on Raymond beyond the terms of a paternity acknowledgement he had signed at Jackson's birth, which established his legal fatherhood and his corresponding child support obligation. She was not entitled to alimony. She was not entitled to any share of the property at Stonebrook Crossing. She was not, under Ohio law, considered a defrauded spouse because she was not, technically, a spouse. Her attorney filed a civil suit alleging fraudulent misrepresentation, arguing that Crystal had made concrete and demonstrable life decisions, including declining a professional opportunity in another city, based on representations Raymond had made about their future that he had no intention of honoring. That case moved slowly. It took 19 months to reach a settlement. The settlement amount was not disclosed. Crystal's attorney described it as meaningful but insufficient. Raymond Mercer cooperated with both proceedings. He did not contest the divorce. He did not attempt to avoid the paternity support determination for Jackson. His attorney, in the civil case, argued that his representations to Crystal had reflected his genuine intentions at the time and that the failure to follow through was the result of circumstances and not deliberate fraud. The judge in the civil case did not fully accept that argument, which is why the case settled rather than proceeding to verdict. Raymond was never criminally charged. He was never arrested. He was never photographed in handcuffs or perp-walked through a courthouse. He lost his marriage, a significant portion of his financial assets, his standing in the social community he and Diane had shared for 15 years, and, for a period, his relationship with his daughter Madison, who at 11 years old was old enough to understand that her father had done something that hurt her mother very badly and had responded by shutting him out with the uncomplicated moral clarity that 11-year-olds are sometimes capable of. There are two children at the center of this story, Madison Mercer and Jackson Hollis. They are, as of the time this script was written, teenagers, Madison 14, Jackson 13. They are half-siblings. They share a biological father. They grew up 3 miles apart, in the same school district, in the same American suburb, completely unaware of each other's existence. They may have passed each other at a park. They may have sat near each other at a county fair or a weekend soccer tournament without knowing they were connected. The world is full of these invisible overlaps, these missed recognitions. But this particular one was not accidental. It was engineered. And the question of what to do with that knowledge, and when to introduce the children to each other, and how to explain to a 13-year-old boy why his father had a daughter he never mentioned, is not a question that any court order or legal settlement can answer. It is a question that lives in the space between families, in the conversations that adults have to have with children that no one is ever fully prepared for. Diane made the decision, in the spring of 2021, to tell Madison the full story, age-appropriately, carefully, with the help of the therapist she had been seeing. She did not wait for Madison to be older. She did not want her daughter to find out through a social media search or a careless comment from a relative. She sat with Madison in the living room of the apartment she had moved into after the divorce. She had not stayed in the Stonebrook Crossing house, could not. The memories were too embedded in the walls, and she told her daughter that her father had been in another relationship for most of Madison's life, and that there was a boy named Jackson who was her half-brother. Madison was 12 when she learned this. She did not speak for a very long time. Then she asked if Jackson knew about her. Diane said she didn't know. Madison said she wanted to know if he did. Crystal had told Jackson the summer before, in the summer of 2020, when he was 7. She had used simpler language. Your daddy has another family that he kept secret, and that was very wrong of him, and it wasn't your fault, and it wasn't your sister's fault. Jackson had asked what his sister's name was. Crystal told him. Jackson had asked if he could meet her. Crystal said she hoped so, someday, when the grown-ups had figured out how to make it safe. Jackson accepted that the way children accept incomprehensible adult realities, with a literalness that is both heartbreaking and remarkably undamaged, and then he asked if he could have a snack. Children are sometimes the most resilient people in the room, and sometimes that resilience is simply the way the wound goes underground and waits. Madison and Jackson met for the first time in October 2021, 2 years to the month after the wrong turn on Whitmore Drive. The meeting was arranged by Diane and Crystal, coordinated through their respective attorneys, and took place at a neutral location, a park in Dublin, Ohio, with both mothers present and no expectation of how it would go. They were 12 and 8. Madison was tall and quiet, with Diane's brown eyes. Jackson was small for his age and talkative, with Raymond's laugh, a fact that neither Crystal nor Diane commented on that afternoon, though both of them noticed it immediately and felt it like a small, precise pain. The children played. That is not a dramatic summary. They actually played. They found a piece of shared ground within the first 15 minutes, a mutual love of the same animated series on Netflix. And by the end of the afternoon, they were sitting on a bench talking with the uncomplicated ease of children who do not yet know how unusual their situation is. Raymond's relationship with both children is, as of this writing, functional but complicated. He sees Madison on a schedule that was established in the divorce agreement, alternate weekends and several weeks in summer, and their relationship has been slowly, incrementally rebuilt over 3 years of effort from both of them. He is active in Jackson's life as well, having formalized his paternity and support arrangement through the family court. He sees Jackson on a similar schedule. Both children, on certain holidays, are in the same room as their father. Whether that room ever also includes both mothers in any sustained or meaningful social sense, is a question that remains open. Diane and Crystal have developed a relationship that is best described as a pragmatic alliance. They communicate when they need to, about the children and practical matters, with a level of mutual respect that neither of them would have been able to predict in those early weeks when the whole thing was still on fire. Raymond Mercer's story is extreme in its duration and its proximity, 12 years, 2 complete households, 3 miles apart. But the pattern underneath it is not extreme at all. It is, in fact, documented, studied, and more common than the public conversation about infidelity typically acknowledges. The psychology of long-term double-life maintenance has been examined by researchers and clinicians for decades, and what they find, consistently, is that the men, and it is most often men, though not exclusively, who sustain these arrangements for years do not fit the profile of the cold, calculating sociopath that fiction tends to produce. They are often described by people who know them as warm, generous, socially skilled, and emotionally intelligent. They are often genuinely attached to both families. The deception is not a performance layered over a hollow interior. It is, in a way that is difficult to articulate without sounding like an excuse, something they have compartmentalized so completely that each life is fully real to them while they are in it. This is not an excuse. Let that be clear. The suffering Raymond Mercer caused, to Diane, to Crystal, to 2 children who will spend their entire lives processing the architecture of their beginnings, is real and serious and not diminished by any psychological explanation of how it was possible. But understanding how it was possible matters, because the alternative is to treat these cases as aberrations committed by monsters, and the evidence does not support that framing. The evidence supports a more uncomfortable reading, that the capacity for this kind of sustained, damaging self-deception exists in ordinary people, in ordinary circumstances, and that the primary protective factors against it are not superior virtue, but rather the mundane practical barriers, financial constraint, geographic distance, social accountability, that make double lives logistically impossible for most people. Raymond did not succeed for 12 years because he was uniquely malevolent. He succeeded because he had enough money, enough mobility, and enough social skill to manage the logistics. And because the people who loved him trusted him. There is also the question of what Diane and Crystal missed, not as an accusation, but as a genuine inquiry into the signals that existed and went unread. Both women, looking back, can identify moments. The 2 in the morning phone in the dark kitchen. The geographic pattern of ATM withdrawals. The divorce that was perpetually 6 months away. Crystal's mother Shirley, who did not trust Raymond from the beginning, has said in subsequent conversations that her unease was always present, but she allowed herself to be overridden by her daughter's happiness. This is the texture of how these things work. The flags are not always invisible. They are sometimes entirely visible and still somehow not quite legible, because the story in which they exist has been built so carefully, with so many supporting details and so much accumulated evidence of trustworthiness, that the mind reaches naturally for the benign interpretation. We are wired, as social animals, to trust the people we have chosen. That wiring is not a failure. It is what makes intimacy possible. The broader social and legal landscape around cases like Raymond's is slowly changing. Several states in recent years have expanded their civil fraud statutes to address what some attorneys call relational fraud, the use of deliberate misrepresentation to induce another person to make major life decisions based on false premises. Crystal's civil case was an early and imperfect example of this legal theory being applied. The argument is straightforward. If a contractor defrauds a client by misrepresenting what they will deliver, the client has legal recourse. If a person defrauds a partner by misrepresenting the fundamental nature of their relationship, their availability, their intentions, their other commitments, the partner has been harmed in concrete and demonstrable ways and should have some recourse beyond the purely symbolic. These legal arguments are not universally accepted, and the law in most states remains several steps behind the social reality. But the cases are accumulating, and the conversation is happening. Diane Mercer has rebuilt, which is both the simplest and the most significant thing that can be said about the last 5 years of her life. She still works as a dental hygienist at a different practice now, in a suburb north of Columbus. She moved into a two-bedroom apartment after the divorce was finalized and stayed there for 2 years before buying a small house. Just her and Madison, in a neighborhood that has no previous associations, no memories embedded in the walls, no Tuesday dinners and Christmas mornings that need to be overlaid with new versions of themselves. She has a dog named Charlie. She has a close relationship with her sister Karen, who was there from the first Sunday afternoon on the back porch. She is in a relationship. She has been for about a year now, with a man she met through a mutual friend, and she will tell you that the experience of loving someone after what Raymond did is different in ways she is still learning to describe. More conscious, more deliberate, less assumption, more conversation. She said in a recent interview with a local women's publication, "I trusted my whole life. Now I trust deliberately, and I think that's actually better, even though it's harder." Crystal Hollis moved back to Chillicothe for 18 months after the collapse, moved into her mother Shirley's house with Jackson, and rebuilt herself from the closest point of safety she had. She returned to Columbus in 2021 to a different neighborhood, a rental on the east side of the city with a yard big enough for Jackson and his collection of secondhand bikes. She went back to school. She had always wanted to finish a nursing degree she had started in her early 20s and dropped when her first job in medical billing turned into a career. She is currently in her second year of an RN program at Columbus State. Shirley, who drives up from Chillicothe to watch Jackson on the days Crystal has evening classes, has said that her daughter is the strongest person she knows and that she also wishes she had listened to her own instincts 8 years earlier. Both things are true. They usually are. Raymond Mercer is living in a one-bedroom apartment in Gahanna, the suburb where he grew up, the place he came from before all of this. He works for a different company now, in a regional accounts role with less travel. His parents, Gary and Carol, know everything. The conversation he had with them in the winter of 2019 is one he has described, to the therapist he began seeing after the divorce, as the single most painful thing he has ever done, not the confrontations with Diane or Crystal, but telling his father. Gary Mercer, who worked 31 years in a manufacturing plant and coached Little League and never, not once, gave his son any reason to think this kind of behavior was acceptable, sat in his kitchen and listened, and then stood up and went out to his garage and did not come back inside for 2 hours. Raymond sat with his mother at the kitchen table, and neither of them spoke. That is the shape of certain consequences, not legal, not financial, but the ones that live in the rooms where you grew up, in the faces of people who believed in you before you had done anything to earn it. He sees Madison and Jackson on alternating schedules. He attends Jackson's school events when Crystal allows it. He drives Madison to soccer practice on the weekends he has her, and sits in the bleachers next to other fathers who, presumably, have only one set of bleachers to sit in. He is not a villain in the way that stories like this sometimes want their central figure to be, sharply drawn, clearly evil, cleanly distinguishable from the rest of us. He is, instead, something more troubling, a recognizable person who made a decision that became a pattern, that became a structure, that became a decade, and who lived inside that structure long enough that it became, in some awful sense, normal. Not acceptable, not right, but normal, the way any sustained reality becomes normal when you stop comparing it to what it should be and start simply living in what it is. There is a moment in this story that I keep returning to. It is not the wrong turn, though that is where everything broke open. It is not the confrontation at the kitchen table, or the meeting at the Panera on Polaris Parkway, or the first time Madison and Jackson played in a park and talked about Netflix shows as though they were just two kids and not the living proof of a 12-year deception. The moment I keep returning to is this: Diane, lying awake in the dark next to Raymond in the weeks before she found the bank records, feeling something she could not name, having a thought she refused to finish. That moment, of knowing without knowing, of sensing the thing that the conscious mind is not ready to accept, is the most human moment in the entire story. Because every person listening to this has had some version of that moment. Not necessarily about a second family, not necessarily in a marriage, but in some relationship, some friendship, some professional arrangement, some situation in which we chose to reach for the comfortable interpretation because the uncomfortable one was too costly to hold. We do not always get the luxury of a wrong turn that makes the truth unavoidable. Sometimes the detour never comes, and we spend years next to something we could have known but chose, in the smallest and most human way, not to pursue. This is not a failing unique to Diane or Crystal. It is one of the central, recurring conditions of trusting another person. You cannot be fully intimate with someone and simultaneously maintain the vigilance of a private investigator. The two postures are incompatible. Intimacy requires the lowering of a certain kind of guard, and the people who exploit that lowering, who use the trust that love requires as the operating environment for their deception, are committing a harm that is real and serious even when no law exists to name it cleanly. The question this story leaves open, and it is not a comfortable question, is this: how well do we actually know the people we share our lives with? Not in the paranoid sense, not in the sense of compulsive verification and surveillance of the people we love, but in the basic, honest sense. Do we know them, or do we know the version of themselves they have chosen to show us? These are not always different things. For most people, in most relationships, what you see is substantially what is there. But Raymond Mercer's story, and the dozens of stories like it that surface every year in small-town newspapers and viral TikTok threads and family law courtrooms across this country, are a reminder that the gap between those two things can be enormous, and that the gap can exist for years before anything forces it into the open. We are all, to some degree, living on faith. The question is what we do with the moments when the faith asks us to look away. Diane Mercer would not trade the knowledge for the comfort of not knowing. She has said this clearly and more than once, to her therapist, and to her sister Karen, and eventually to herself. Sitting in the quiet of the small house she bought with no previous associations, with Charlie the dog at her feet and Madison asleep down the hall. The truth cost her something enormous. The marriage she thought she had. The version of the last 12 years that she had been living. The easy, unexamined faith in a man whose laugh she knew and whose shoes were by the back door every night, and who cried when his daughter was born. All of that was real, and all of it was also not the full picture. She lost both things at once, the real parts and the lie that the real parts were wrapped around. And the grief of that is not simple and does not resolve cleanly. But she would not trade it for the alternative. Because the alternative, she says, was continuing to build her life on a foundation that would have eventually given way regardless, and the later the collapse, the worse the fall. Crystal Hollis would not trade it either. She gave 8 years to a fiction, and she will carry the particular sadness of that for the rest of her life. Not every day, not overwhelmingly, but as a permanent awareness of what those years were and were not. But she also has Jackson, who is 13 now, and building something out of the materials of his actual life rather than the story Raymond told. She has her nursing program and her mother's house on weekends, and the slow, brick-by-brick reconstruction of a self that was built around someone else's lies and had to be taken down and reassembled around something more solid. And she has, unexpectedly, a relationship with Diane Mercer. Not a friendship exactly, but something real. Two women who were wronged by the same person in the same city on the same calendar, who met across a table in a Panera with coffee neither of them wanted, and chose to face the same truth together rather than alone. That choice, to face it together, is the most dignified thing in this entire story. And it is entirely theirs. Before you go, and I genuinely hope you'll stay for one more moment, I want to ask you something. Because this channel exists for conversations like the one this story opens up, would you have seen the signs? Not as a criticism of Diane or Crystal, because as we have talked about, the signs were subtle and expertly buried, and both women are clearly intelligent, capable people. But honestly, for yourself, are there things in your own life, relationships, situations, arrangements, where you have reached for the comfortable interpretation and stepped back from the one that would cost you more to accept? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the actual question this story is asking, if you let it. Leave your answer, or your reaction, or what part of this story hit you hardest, in the comments below. This community is built on those conversations, and every single comment gets read. And if you thought this story was something, if you found yourself unable to stop watching because you needed to know how it ended, then you absolutely cannot miss what is coming next to this channel. And if you are not subscribed, you will miss it. So hit that subscribe button right now, because these are the stories that deserve to be told with the full weight they carry, and this channel is the place where that happens. Thank you, genuinely, for spending this time here. Take care of the people who trust you, and we will see you in the next one.